Who says you need to be a pro painter to get good results? Pretentious goats is who. Thankfully, this video will serve as encouragement to you, dear listener, and a big middle finger salute to the naysayers. My name is Benji, and this is Marvel Crisis Protocol's Baron Zemo Speed Painting Guide for the Casual Painter. And as I'm sure you've already guessed, I am not myself a pro painter, but one thing I do know is that the learning curve to make a miniature look good on the tabletop is not as steep as you might think. So let's help you find the right balance between speed and quality. At the core of this guide, and what we'll be using, is the Citadel Contrast paint range, which more or less allows you to get the same effect as applying a base coat and a wash all in one go. But because you might already have or prefer a different range of paints, we'll pop the names of the closest equivalents up on screen as we go. First things first then, you need to prime your model. We're opting to use the complimentary Wraithbone spray can, as it gives a more natural and organic look when the contrast is applied. Of course, if you plan to use a different type of primer, make sure it's a white or off-white, because these paints just ain't gonna work on darker tones. Good old Apothecary White is up next for the fur on the jacket and on the edges of the braces. Rough texture like this is perfect for contrast paints, and although the Apothecary White makes things look more dirty white than anything, it still works perfectly for us here. Now, one thing contrast doesn't do particularly well is your metallics. This is the 4th Crisis Protocol model I've painted, and I've long since abandoned using contrast paints for silver. So here we are, having applied a coat of lead belcher on the sword, the circlet around Zemo's head, and the belt buckle. Remember, when using conventionally mixed acrylic paints, you won't need the slightly larger brush, as you're not caking it on as much. So just make sure you apply the coat nice and even. As you'll see, we also took this opportunity to paint the metallic grating on the base as well. Speed painting's all about the efficiency. Now that the fur around the braces has dried, we opted for some Space Wolves grey on the rest of the braces, complementing the off-white on the fur with a nice light blue-grey. Contrast can be a bit trickier to apply on surfaces with little in the way of recesses, but you can still see if it settles nicely up against the fur, and the surface area around the arm is fairly small, so this step's easy enough. Next up, you need a decent dollop or two of Black Templar on your brush for the trousers and boots. Try and leave a fair amount of paint on the model initially, and then just keep an eye out for excessive pooling. But the healthy amount of creases and the pose of the model shouldn't give you too much trouble. As you can see, the paint also indirectly and helpfully creates a lighter shade on the raised parts. Then it was time to put their jacket on with some snakebite leather. Once again, with a similar creasy consistency to the trousers, this applied very easily. And don't worry about the fasteners on the front, we'll go back over them later. Wildwood was up next to cover the remainder of the belt and the pouches on it. A fairly straightforward process, although you may notice for the first time the imperfect pooling of contrast paint on flat surfaces. Again, much like the braces, it has little to no impact at a glance, but do bear that in mind before moving on. Now, whilst we'd given up the ghost on making silvers work with contrast paints, we hadn't quite thrown the towel in with regards to golds and bronzes. So a dose of Iandan yellow was used over the lead belcher on the hilt of the sword, the belt buckle and the circlet. That base coat of lead belcher does a decent job of letting some metallic seep through, but the jury's still out on whether I'm happy with this method of doing gold. Somewhat jarringly, and owing to the Baron's eccentric fashion sense, we use a coat of Magos purple for what we'll call the overgarment and the gloves. Again, due to the creases in the fabric, the only area you might want to be careful with the brush is where it borders with the undergarment, as it will be the easiest thing in the world for the paint to slip down to the more recessed part of the torso. And to finish the one coat over the model, we splashed some Volupus pink on said undergarment and on the head and neck area, which again shouldn't be too difficult because it's the most recessed part of the torso. Just don't get too hasty before you're almost done. All that's left to do with the base then is to coat some basilicanum grey on the non-metallic parts. Again, on a relatively flat space you'll see pooling in random places, but make sure there's nothing too egregious and job's a good un. And there you have the Baron Zemo tabletop ready in no time at all. Yes, contrast paints do have limitations, but they're few and far between for what you get in return. However, whilst that might be more than enough for what you need, we're going to continue our journey and add a few highlights and finishing touches to the model. Again, nothing too excessive in the spirit of this video, but for just a little extra time at the paint station, we can get some nice results. First up was a light highlight of white scar on the fur parts found on the jacket and the braces. You don't need much paint on the brush to make life slightly easier in making sure you just cover those raised parts. Now, for some reason I wasn't happy with the leather on the jacket, so I opted to give it another wash with some Agrax Earthshade. Just trying to darken the brown tone a little bit, but to be quite honest, I'm not sure it did what I'd hoped it would, so consider this a completely optional step. Next was some highlights on the trousers. I started with some Eshing Grey on the less prominently raised parts with a thin brush, and then placed some Dawnstone on the most raised areas. But I think in the interest of speed painting you could just apply the Dawnstone and the gradient contrast would work just as well to the naked eye. Genestealer Purple was the highlight of choice for the overgarment and gloves and provided just about the right combination with the Magos Purple we applied earlier. The undergarment had me second guessing myself just like with the jacket, which I felt needed a further wash before highlighting, so a coat of Caribou Crimson was employed to emphasise the reds, but then we brought back the brightness with a highlight of Pink Horror, which is quite honestly what I should have done in the first place and not bothered with a wash, so feel free to skip the wash step as well. The belt highlighting was next, and my go-to for this step is a colour found in the base paint range, Steel Legion Drab. This definitely makes the leather pop, and you can also obscure any uneven pooling that we already talked about but didn't deal with during the contrast step. And then it was really just touching up with some lead belcher on all the buttons and clasps and fasteners on the boots, belt and the lapel. If you're minded to do this step, make sure you go over where it's needed with a fine-tooth comb, because these small bits can easily get missed. Which leaves just the dry brush of Administratum Grey on the metallic parts of the base. Make sure when dry brushing flat surfaces to really make sure the bulk of the paint's off the brush, and then very carefully brush back and forth, as it's the easiest thing in the world to get a streaky finish on the flats here. And that, as they say, is that. I'm sure many of you will be happy with just the contrast paint steps, but it just goes to show what can be achieved with minimal time investment. Stay tuned for more speed painting guides for those that want less time painting and more time gaming. Alas, I have been the voice in your head, and this video has ended.